what does our text say about us? One of the reasons we reflect and write a reflective commentary, if you're an English student, or write a set of annotations reflecting on your choices if you're an EAL student, is that you want to think about, what does your text say about you? What are you interested in? What are you passionate about? What do you want to say about the framework of ideas? So writing is always a reflection of your values and who you are, and is a reflection of who you are in some way, even if it's fictional and things are embellished. So that's a good opportunity to think about, what are you trying to say in your text, and what does it say about who you are? Hi again, I'm Victoria Buzzard, and today I'm going to be talking about reflecting and how important that is in the creative process. So what's in this lesson? Key requirements from the study design for English and EAL students will be looked at. Key skills from the area of study. We're going to discuss what reflecting could include and talk a little bit about the planning and writing processes for reflecting, and then look at a sample reflection to see how that can be done effectively. The most relevant study design dot points in terms of reflecting include the importance of explaining and commenting on the vocabulary, text structures, language features, conventions, and ideas used in one's writing, and then reflecting on and sharing the implications of authorial choices in one's writing. Implications is a really good word there, because you want to talk about the intended effect that you wanted to achieve in your writing. So, for example, I chose to use a metaphor. You might quote from your piece where you use the metaphor and then explain the intended effect on the audience and why you chose to include that. Then you will apply standard and non-standard conventions of language, including syntax, punctuation, and spelling. So that's really, how is your piece written? Is the correct spelling? Is there correct grammar? Does it flow? Is it precise use of language? That's all of what is going to be looked at in a reflective piece of writing. Key requirements from the study design. So as you can see, 20 marks for the SACs, for the two SACs. There's 20 marks for the first SAC, a written text constructed in consideration of audience, purpose, and context. Then another 20 marks for another written text, which will be a different text, and it will have an audience, purpose, and context as well. Then for English students will need to explain their decisions made through the writing processes, and that is also worth 20 marks. So that will be the form of a commentary reflecting on writing processes. So a commentary is an analytical piece of writing, and your teachers at your school will provide you with guidance about the word length, but probably somewhere around 500 to 600 words. Explaining, justifying, and writing about the decisions you made in your text. For EAL students, it's a bit different. So rather than write a reflective commentary, you will comment on the decisions made through the writing processes. This is only worth 10 marks rather than 20, and it will look like a set of annotations reflecting on the writing processes rather than a longer reflective commentary. It will be more about thinking about perhaps printing off a piece of writing that you've done, your text, highlighting, annotating, drawing arrows, writing some notes about perhaps a language feature like a rhetorical question, and then explaining the intended impact on your audience. Now, important to understand here that the reflecting is only a requirement for the SAC. You do not need to complete a reflective commentary or a set of annotations during the end of year exam. You won't receive any marks for that, so definitely be mindful that this is just a requirement for SACs. At the end of your examination, you only produce a text. Some key skills relevant for Unit 3 Outcome 2 include, it includes a reflection on the implications of authorial choices in your own writing, which is really thinking about what were you hoping to achieve in terms of the author? What was your key idea that you wanted to explore? What was some of the language features that you wanted to include? You would explain and comment on the vocabulary, text structures, and language features of your piece, and just be mindful that you can't comment on every single text structure and language feature or aspect of vocabulary in your piece. So you need to be discerning about which features you want to include. So you pick the ones that you're most proud of or that are most important to your piece of writing to be successful. And then you want to really go into them in depth. Then you want to explain and comment on conventions and ideas used in your writing, particularly conventions of the form. So, for example, if you're writing a memoir and you're using sort of flashbacks, then that's going to be a key convention that you would talk about and analyse in your commentary. And then you would also want to apply standard, non-standard conventions of language, including syntax, punctuation, spelling, where appropriate. What could reflecting include? Some elements you could comment on. So when you're writing your reflective commentary or a set of annotations, if you're EAL, then these are some of the aspects you would want to talk about. Voice. What kind of voice did you try to cultivate in your piece? Were you trying to be really informal and friendly and colloquial? Or were you trying to convey a lot of honesty and vulnerability? And how did you do that through the voice that you created? Register and style. Similar to voice, register refers to the formality of your piece. So the level of formality of your piece is going to be influenced by the form that you've chosen. So if it's a podcast, that's all about talking, that's going to be far more informal. Whereas if you're writing an opinion piece, the register might have some more formality to it. Style, what kind of personal style have you tried to use within your writing? What sort of creative flair have you used? Literary features used. So you may have used metaphors. You might explain one of the metaphors that you used, provide a quote of it, and then explain the intended effect of it. You definitely want to explain a key idea or concept that you've chosen in relation to the framework. That could be something like belonging for the framework, writing about country, for example. And you want to explain and justify why you chose that concept and how you felt you were able to explore it effectively. Structural elements. What kind of structural elements did you use in keeping with your form? How do you explore the framework of ideas? In terms of, for example, if it was writing about play, how do you explore that framework of ideas within your piece? And then also form, audience, and purpose. This would definitely be something I would be starting with early in your commentary or focusing on early on in your annotations if you're an EAL student, focusing on, what exact form are you writing in, who's your specific audience, and what is your exact purpose that you're trying to achieve. And the more specific you can be about that, the better. And then also, how did you use the title you were given and how did you incorporate the stimulus material into your piece? So these are all features that I would be recommending you try to reflect on. The writing process for reflecting. So some useful steps for reflecting. You want to plan for reflecting. You want to complete either a table or a draft of your reflection. You would then write your commentary or annotations, and then you would edit your own work to see whether or not you could refine your vocabulary, think about whether or not you're being specific enough in terms of the intended impact on the audience. Plan for reflecting. A possible planning template you can use to plan your commentary or annotations is listed below. And this is one example of how you could construct this, but this isn't the only example that you could use. One of the things you may want to start with is by introducing or identifying the text type and context that you've chosen. Then I would suggest you focus on which mentor text or supplementary text interested you. So, for example, you might say that if you were doing writing about country, that you were interested in the mentor text, The Hate Race. Or if you read a supplementary text, which was on a similar idea about migration, such as a feature article, you would include the name of that. You would also then say which language and structural features of the mentor texts you aimed to include. And it would be great to provide details, including quotations from your piece, to demonstrate how you tried to do that. I would suggest you discuss or highlight at least 2 or 3 devices or structures in your piece, though try not to quote or underline more than a phrase at a time. You don't want to summarize your piece. You need to be mindful that this is an analytical statement. So you're providing an example of a device, such as a simile, then you're providing a quote from where you use the simile, and then you would be explaining the intended effect and justifying why you chose that simile and how it helped you develop your particular idea. Also, you would reflect on your purpose and how you linked your purpose to your audience. And you would reflect on your piece and the connection to the chosen stimuli and title. So a few tips to remember. Always write the reflective piece or annotations after you've written your text. It will be so much easier for you. Then analyze rather than summarize your choices, focusing on the intended effect. If you keep coming back to the intended effect on your chosen audience, it will allow you to remember the importance of analysing and will hopefully stop you from falling into the trap of summarising. So summarising is just when you're telling what you did rather than explaining why you did it. So think about always examining the why. And then remember, you can also reflect on the difficulties you found in the process. You don't have to say it was all easy. You might say it was really difficult to come up with an idea in the first place. You didn't know what to write. And the planning process was incredibly difficult for you. But you can also talk about how you attempted to overcome these difficulties within your commentary or your set of annotations as well. So a little activity now for planning to reflect. So an alternative way to plan for your reflection is using a table like the one below. And you would use a piece of writing that you've already created to fill in this table. And you can then use this as a guide for your full commentary that you would write or for your set of annotations if you're an EAL student. So you would fill in the table below to complete the activity. You would look at an extract or quote from your writing. Then you would explain the idea, language, device, or feature used in your writing, and then explain the intended effect on the audience. Okay, so let's have a look at an example of how you could have filled this in. Obviously, yours is going to look completely different to mine because your text will be unique. But this is an example of how you could have filled it in. So, for example, an extract or quote, "The white snow glinted on the rocks." So that's an example of imagery, and then the intended effect on the audience. I wanted the readers to appreciate both my familiarity with the Alaskan landscape and its people. So that is an example of something that could be turned into a sentence where you would merge the language device, the quote, and then the intended effect, or perhaps a couple of sentences. You could turn this sort of template into a longer commentary. And if you're doing annotations, it would provide an example of something you could highlight, something you could write, say imagery, and then a little explanation of the effect. Another example, Victoria, the Twin Towers have been struck by terrorists. So that's an example of direct speech, which is a language device or feature, and the intended effect. I wanted to convey a sense of rising tension, which is typical of the rising action stage of a narrative. But it also helps establish the external crisis of September 11, which influences the internal crisis I felt subsequently that I was an outsider. Then finally, was I an imposter, which is an example of internal monologue. I wanted to mirror this technique of Beneba Clark's to provide the reader with more insight into how I was feeling at the time to foster a deeper connection. So hopefully you can see here, this is another good planning template to use when you're going about the reflection process. Let's have a look at a sample reflection. If you were writing a set of annotations as an EAL student, you wouldn't be writing a really long piece like this, but you might use a key like this one provided here, and that could be a useful way to sort of highlight or colour code your piece and then perhaps provide more detailed annotations about the text type or about voice, for example. So that's how it would look a little bit different. But hopefully this will still be very helpful to you to inform the understanding of what you need to be commenting on. This reflection is about the 700 word mark, which might be a little long. It depends on what your school provides in terms of guidelines for reflective commentary. There is no exact word limit, and some students will certainly write this much reflecting on their text. I think it does a good job of explaining the various elements that are used within my piece of writing. So have a look at the key, and I suggest you use your handout to highlight as we go along and possibly add some annotations as well. So I chose to write a hybrid short story and memoir. So in the first sentence, I begin with the text type, and that's really important. You want to make it really clear what your text type is. And if you are doing a hybrid or a blend of two different text types or forms, you want to make that clear as well. So I chose to write a hybrid short story and memoir piece drawn from personal experience as an exchange student in Fairbanks, Alaska in 2001. I wanted to reflect on this influential time in my formative years and the personal growth I underwent as a result of travelling and living in another country for a year. So I've provided some background about my inspiration for the text, why I wanted to write this text, and I think that's really important to provide the inspiration for your text. Then I've focused in on the key idea that I'm exploring. I was interested in exploring the binary of belonging and disconnection, so two different things, belonging versus disconnection, which I explored through bringing about the problem that I was faced with, the Twin Tower attacks, living in America but not being an American. I was intrigued by the experience of an outsider who felt disconnected from the country I was living in, but at the same time intrinsically connected in other ways. So I'm explaining here my key ideas and how one can feel both very connected to place, but also disconnected in other ways, as sort of the key idea I'm wanting to explore. Then I start to talk a little bit about the process of writing itself. There are moments where I also express myself through my attempts to unearth my identity from decades gone by, and certainly use some creative license in the process made necessary by the unreliability of one's memory. So I'm sort of acknowledging here that I'm writing about this from a long time ago in my past, from 22 years ago, and it's difficult to remember everything. So whilst I'm trying to be honest and authentic about what happened, there are some aspects where I'm embellishing and making things up, which is also how it is sort of part fiction, part memoir as well. So then I go on to talk about the narrative perspective used, which I think is a really important feature to discuss in your reflection. I used a first-person retrospective narrator to reflect back on my experience 22 years earlier and provide glimpses of maturity and insight, which I did not really possess at the time, such as the gratitude I felt for my parents. But I also wanted the story to feel authentic to my character at the time, so I tried to cultivate a teenage voice by referencing my interests like snowboarding and reading dolly magazines. So here I'm talking about how I tried to cultivate voice, the voice of my piece, and what influenced the voice. So the narrative perspective influenced the voice, so did my language choices and my key ideas as well. Then I talk a little bit about structure and the structure of my piece. I considered structure carefully and used a typical short story narrative arc. I chose to use a dream sequence to commence the story, which allowed me to illustrate my connection to place and show my appreciation for the natural beauty of Alaska. I also weaved in flashbacks of my time travelling with my parents or moments from back home in Australia, as I wanted my dual identity of part Australian and part American to come across. My advice to you when you're talking about structure is to make sure you're always talking about the why. So you can see there I've mentioned the dream sequence and I've explained why I've used it. Or I've spoken about the flashbacks and why I've used them. If you don't talk about the why, it will just end up being a summary here. And I find structure is often an area where students can fall into the trap of summarising rather than analysing. So that's something to be especially mindful of. So the reflection continues, and I start talking a little bit about the mentor text that inspired me. I was inspired by the extract of The Hate Race we studied. I attempted to mirror some of Beneba Clark's literary techniques, such as the use of internal monologue in italics. I used the same technique to convey my internal crisis. Was I an imposter? So I've mentioned the mentor text. I've mentioned the specific literary feature that's used, and then I've used an example where I've mirrored that by using a quote. Then I've mentioned another literary device here. This, alongside imagery, another device, was used similarly to Beneba Clark. And then the why, to capture my connection to the landscape. The white snow glinted on the rocks. And then an explanation of intended effect, which, as I've mentioned a few times, is incredibly important. I wanted the readers to appreciate both my familiarity with the Alaskan landscape and its people, but on this day of tragedy, convey the disconnection I felt at being an outsider. Then I've gone into the key ideas being explored a little bit more. I use this notion of dual identities coexisting within oneself, so both being present, in an attempt to convey the complex idea of belonging to country and the way in which this concept is dynamic and constantly in flux. So that means that one doesn't always have the same feeling or connection to a place. That can actually change. Then referencing another mentor text that I've used. Cassie Lynch's Split inspired me to explore this notion of binaries and how they can coexist, as it resonated with me. Then I go on to talk about some literary devices. Additionally, I used the Vegemite as an allusion to Australia and chose it because it was a typical breakfast food I enjoyed growing up and still do. And then focusing on the effect in relation to the audience there, which I knew would also be familiar and likely nostalgic with my fellow Australian readers. So I'm making it clear who the audience is here. I chose it as my title, so focusing in on the key idea here, as it encapsulated the centrality of my home country to my identity. And then being really explicit here about audience, which is a very important part of reflecting. I hope to share this story with my family, friends, and my Year 12 students to encourage them to not be afraid to write from personal experience. In particular, I wrote the story for my parents, and then an explanation of the key idea or purpose here, as I want them to know what my experience was like and that I am grateful for all they've done to support me. So always coming back to purpose or intended effect after I've explained a feature of my writing. And then this is the end of the commentary now. The commentary then talks about the title and stimuli and how I attempted to incorporate that. I found the title The Journey fairly natural to incorporate, and I tried to tie it into my time as an exchange student and my journey of realisation. I discovered that day that one can never forget one's home country, no matter the distance. It's important to think about where you want to use the title and justify how you've tried to internalise it and relate it to your piece in a meaningful way. And then the stimuli. It's important to state, I believe, which stimuli you've used, why you've used it, and then also, again, how it complements the ideas that you're exploring. So I've said here, I responded to all three stimuli at different points throughout the piece. I commenced by incorporating the Ed Sheeran lyrics and the idea of being carefree and not having all the answers, but being blissfully ignorant. During the rising action climax and falling action stages of my narrative, I primarily focused on the photograph with the path and linked this to the title to focus on my self-discovery and the path I was forging during my time overseas, away from my family and friends. I concluded the story by coming to a realisation that whilst I was happy I had taken the path less travelled and would not have traded that experience for anything, I ultimately knew my return path back home was where I needed to go. So remember to talk about where you've used the title and which stimuli, or all of them perhaps, if you've used all of them, you've used and when you've used them. Now this is an example of a reflection There are many other ways you could write a reflection. This is just one example, but I think it covers a lot of the key elements that I would be suggesting you focus on in explaining and justifying in your reflection. So a summary of the lesson, some key takeaways. So when reflecting on your writing, remember the key requirements from the study design. Also remember the key skills from this area of study. Think about the aspects you can highlight through your reflection, such as voice, the mentor texts you are inspired by, audience, your purpose, your form, your language devices, and so on. And then the importance of planning and editing your reflection for spelling, grammar, vocabulary, and clarity. Good luck with your reflecting.